It's just, if you read the 14th Amendment, the third, it's a real slap. But this is the kicker part. This is the really important part here. Because slavery was implicit in the Constitution, the word doesn't exist there, but it was implicit in the Constitution, they realized in order to get it out of the Constitution, they had to amend the Constitution. And so these three amendments, the Reconstruction Amendments, were passed. And the 14th Amendment says this, among other things. This is basically how it starts. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Now, so far it seems like we're talking about human beings, right? No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, semicolon. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, semicolon. Nor deny to any person, now notice it doesn't say natural person, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Period, end of sentence. So that was passed in 1873. It was ratified by 3/4 of the states anyway in 1873. And this strange thing started happening. These robber barons had emerged as a result of the Civil War. During the Civil War, Lincoln was just throwing money at the railroads to get war material out to the troops as fast as he could. It was, without the railroads, he wouldn't have been able to win the war. And as a result of this, we had basically 5 guys who were the robber barons of the day. Gould and Huntington, and I'm forgetting all their names now, but Harriman, I think, was one of. In any case, they were names that were well known at that time, and these guys were reaching into the political arena very aggressively, and trying to get not just economic power but political power as well. And the one thing they kept coming up against was all these laws that limited corporate behavior. So there was a series of cases that all originated in the Ninth Circuit in California. Because back in those days, the circuit court judges the Supreme Court judges also served on the circuit. So there were 9 circuit courts, there were 9 justices on the Supreme Court. Each one would ride the circuit for 9 months out of the year and then sit in the Supreme Court for 3 or 4 months. And Stephen J. Field was the justice in California, the Ninth Circuit. And we've learned since then, in fact, we've found the letters in his papers in the National Archives, that the railroads were basically bribing him, and that they were telling him, particularly Huntington and Gould, were telling him that they would support his presidency, his hopes for a presidential candidacy in 1888 or 1890, I forget. It would have been 1888 was the election year. If he would just, do this thing. And so, as I recall, there were 7 occasions in the Ninth Circuit, 5 of which made their way to the Supreme Court, where Gould ruled on behalf of the railroads that because a railroad was being taxed one way in one county and another way in another county, that was unequal protection. That was not equal protection under the law. And that because railroads were persons, albeit artificial, and the 14th Amendment didn't specify only natural persons, clearly the authors of the 14th Amendment intended to include corporations as well as human beings. And in 5 cases, Field ruled explicitly in the Ninth Circuit that corporations were persons under the 14th Amendment, and that as a consequence of this, if Santa Ana County taxed them in one way and Santa Clara County taxed them in another way, that was the same thing as saying that somebody couldn't sit at the lunch counter because of the color of their skin or something like that. That was a violation of equal protection of the law. This 4 times these cases were lost in the Supreme Court. One in one of the early ones when Justice Harlan was a little more outspoken. He actually ridiculed Field, his colleague, for bringing this forward. That was 1882. And finally, in 1886, the 5th case came before the court. It was Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad. The railroad hadn't been paying their taxes for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years. They were refusing to pay the taxes on the fence posts along the rights-of-way, that basically property tax, because they said that the tax rates were different in Santa Ana County. And they did business in both counties, and they should be taxed under state tax laws rather than county tax laws because the counties were taxing them differently, and this was unequal protection. And, you know, I was writing this book about the history of Jefferson, and I was thinking I really want to use original source material as much as possible. And I had read all these histories. I'd read, you know, in fact, during that summer, I had read Charles and Mary Beard's. Charles Beard, the Columbia University professor of history. This is 1930, 1929, 1930. They wrote America's Rise to Civilization, or the American Civilization, or whatever it was. I forget the title, but it was the most prominent, you know, 2-volume, 680-page history of America up to that point that had ever been written. Charles and Mary Beard. Mary was rather famous for her outspoken socialist and feminist activities, and Charles was a world-famous historian at Columbia. And in that book, they talked about how in 1886, in Southern Pacific Railroad, in that Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad case, the Supreme Court ruled that corporations were persons and entitled equal rights under the law. So I assumed that that was the case, having read that. And then I read David Corton's book, When Corporations Rule the World, and David Corton said the same thing. And, you know, I mean, pretty much everything I was reading was saying this. And in fact, the year that this book was published, first published in 2004, I spoke to the Vermont Law School. We had about 300 students and law professors in the room, and I said, how many of you know, and this was not to the public, this was just to the law school. I said, how many of you know that in 1886, in Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, corporations were given the rights of persons and equal protection under the 14th Amendment, you know, as a result of that case? And every person in the room raised their hands. You know, that was just like common knowledge. Everybody believed that to be the case. But there was, you know, I wanted to be able to actually quote the original document. So I went down to the Vermont Supreme Court, and we had this, I just lived 8 blocks from it. You know, what the heck. I was living in Montpelier. And Vermont has this wonderful old law library, because Vermont was a nation before it joined the United States, and it's this beautiful old law library. And went to Paul Donovan, who is an attorney and librarian for the Supreme Court, the head librarian, and said, Paul, I'm looking for that 1886 case where corporations became people. And he said, oh, you mean Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad? I said, yeah. Can you show me the original? And he takes me back in these stacks of these old black leather-bound books with a gilt gold printing on them, you know, published by Biddle and Banks in New York City in 1889, and pulls out and blows the dust off the top of the actual published Supreme Court records from the fall session of 1886. And flips through it and finds he says, well, here's the head note, and here's where the decision starts. He says, you start reading here. And so I just sat down and had about 4 cups of coffee in me, so I could focus on my notepad. And it's about a 16-page decision. You can read it. In fact, I encourage you to read it. And I'm reading through it, and there's all this debate about whether or not the fence posts are property or not under California law, or whether the county's law, the county's rules should dominate, and what's the case. And finally, at the very end, the court, in issuing its ruling, says, and therefore we conclude that because the remedy to this case is found in the Constitution of California, that the railroads have to pay it. And there's this paragraph at the very end. I'm paraphrasing this terribly. It's been decades since I read it, but as I said, you can look it up yourself and read it. There's a paragraph at the end that says words to the effect of, a constitutional argument was among those several arguments presented to the court, but because we found the remedy in the state of California's Constitution, the court chose not to address the constitutional issue. So I'm looking at this going, what the hell? So I went back to Paul and I said, Paul, I think maybe you gave me the wrong case. And he says, well, was it Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad? I said, yeah. And he said, well, I'm pretty sure that's the case. He was a law school graduate and a librarian. And I said, well, come over and take a look at this. And so he comes over to the table, and I'm flipping through it, and I said, now read this last paragraph. And he goes, that's weird. And starts flipping through, and he says, let's read the head note. Maybe there's a clue there. And so we flip back to the beginning, and the head note opens, essentially. There's a brief summary of the case, and then the head note says,